The Soviet Union was going to make history once more after sending the first satellite into space and sending the first human into space. A new target had emerged: the Moon. They built the N-1, a rocket even taller than NASA's Saturn V, designed to propel them to lunar glory. But despite its formidable size and lofty ambition, the N-1 rocket never even cleared Earth's orbit. So why did this mega rocket, which had the potential to place the Soviets ahead in the race to space, end in such a catastrophic failure? It was 1961, the Cold War was at its peak, and space was the new frontier. The Soviets had kept the world with their initial victories in space, up until then a mystery. That changed when President John F. Kennedy came out with a tall order from the United States to land a man on the Moon and return him safely to Earth before the end of the decade. It was more than a call to action. It was more of a declaration of technological supremacy against the backdrop of achievements by the Soviets. It was an invitation that the Soviets couldn't decline. But as the United States began lavishing huge resources upon its Apollo program, the Soviet Union rushed, although it still didn't have an officially declared program. The Soviets would only just commence work in secret on the N-1 rocket that would presumably be their counterpart to the Saturn V. This secrecy also brought along with it a host of internal pressure for success very fast, the first ghost of failure that would haunt the dawn of the N-1 program. On paper, the N-1 was a marvel of engineering, standing 344 feet, a smidgen above the Saturn V, and would carry 95 tons into space. The mission was clear: get a cosmonaut to the Moon before the Americans could plant their flag. What looked imposing on paper would quickly fall apart in practice. One of the most glaring problems with the N-1 was its engine configuration. Unlike the Saturn V, which featured 5 powerful and extensively tested engines in its first stage, the N-1 had an overwhelmingly great total of 30 engines. Why so many? In the case of the Soviet engineers, the urge was to maximize power while working with existent technology. Not having access to engines as large or as reliable as those used by NASA, they tried to compensate with quantity. Well, this was one bet that didn't pay off. Keeping 30 engines running was already a fantastically complicated proposition, introducing a multitude of possible failure points. The system controlling them, called Cord, was supposed to manage them in real time, automatically shutting down any which would malfunction. But Cord was anything but reliable. Even the tiniest failure could trigger a domino effect, with complete disaster ensuing. Time was the greatest antagonist of the N-1, not merely the faulty design. In the pursuit of maintaining its winning streak in space, it overburdened the engineers with pressuring them for speedy results. Premier Nikita Khrushchev and other Soviet officials were clutching at their last straws in response to Kennedy's Moon challenge, and they wanted to do it fast. This dash to the finish line meant corners were cut, especially when it came to testing. NASA's Saturn V was put through rigorous testing procedures, failures analyzed and corrected before any attempts of manned missions. The N-1, on the other hand, was barely tested at all before its first launch. The Soviet engineers were trying to build a moon rocket without the luxury of trial and error. Every failure revealed more important issues with the design of the N-1, yet political pressure didn't weaken. The close spacing between flights meant that engineers were unable to perfect or redesign the rocket, and it produced repeated disasters that only served to stabilize the growing instability of the project. The first launch attempt came in February 1969, just months before NASA's Apollo 11 mission. The Soviet Union was hoping to make a big statement, but was disastrous in its result. Only seconds after liftoff, one of the 30 operation engines blew. Cord tried to shut it down, but the failure overtook the electrical circuitry. Engine after engine died, and within moments, the N-1 lost all thrust and came crashing back to Earth. This was a devastating blow to the Soviet space program. Yet despite the massive failure, the Soviet leadership insisted that the engineers continue. With NASA's Apollo 11 launch looming, those pressures had mounted even higher, but the N-1's problems were only beginning. Just 5 months later, in July 1969, the Soviets tried again with the N-1. The pressure was more extreme than ever before. The NASA's Apollo 11 en route to the Moon. The Soviets were desperately in need to success if they were going to remain in the game. But the second launch was almost worse, because within several seconds of liftoff, a number of engines failed. This time, the rocket didn't just crash, it exploded mid-air, sending fiery debris raining down on the launch site. The Soviets hoped to steal the spotlight from Apollo 11. Instead, they found themselves picking up the pieces of their shattered rocket. At the core of these repeated failures lay the N-1's engine configuration. Where it may have seemed a good idea to use 30 engines as a way of ensuring that the rocket would not face a power shortage, there was just too many failure points in such a configuration. Each of the engines needed to work in concert with the others flawlessly, and minor malfunctioning could have caused chaos. The system for controlling these engines, called cord, was unreliable. In theory, it could shut down individual engines to prevent damage, but in practice, it often misfired. During the second launch, cord shut off engines that were functioning normally while leaving malfunctioning ones running, which only accelerated the disaster. It was simply beyond the capability of Soviet engineers to manage such extreme complexity in the N-1 engine system under immense pressure. The rocket was thus doomed from the outset, without appropriate testing time for refinement. After 2 other failed attempts, the Soviet Union launched its bid for the moon in 1972. This was to be the last go at it. And like all others before, this too exploded. This time it was a big one, which blasted the whole launch pad and practically precluded possibilities of any future attempts. The N-1 program was over. With 4 failed launches and 0 successful orbit, the Soviet Union was forced to concede defeat in the race to the moon. By this time, NASA had not only landed on the moon with Apollo 11, but completed quite a number of other manned lunar missions. The Soviets were by now too far behind. Their resources were also too stretched out to continue. The failure of the N-1 forced the re-evaluation of priorities in the Soviet space program. The dream about the moon had to be forgotten. It was clear that the Soviet Union would never send astronauts there. Instead, Soviet leadership decided to concentrate on another task: space stations. Instead of putting further investments in the N-1, the Soviets started to work on space habitation for a long period. Thus was born the Salyut program and the next one, Mir Space Station, also both very innovative in their time. Though they've never landed a man on the moon, they opened themselves a new route to successful space exploration through continued habitation and scientific research. The failure of the N-1 rocket was a brutal lesson in the risks of rushing complex engineering at the behest of political pressure. It was an extremely bold attempt to directly match NASA's Saturn V, but unable to test and refine their design, the Soviet Union meant that the N-1 never really had any chance of succeeding. Finally, the Soviet space program had success, but not on the moon, with the stars. While the cosmonauts were pioneering the hard way, their contributions, particularly in the space stations and long-duration space stays of today, are still considered vividly relevant, even though the N-1 rocket remains as a relic of a memory of what could have been. We appreciate you watching this video. Be sure to give us a like and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you in the next one.